but in finding those unique ones and combining them in your unique way, those individual things become the basis, the mood board, if you will, from which the actual brand starts to spring. That's how you create a brand that's distinguished and different than anything else. So this is how I think about it. Any creative process, and certainly in brand, there's like a whole world of possibilities for what you can do, like one big V going out from you at the center. And in that world, there's a whole cluster of ideas, thoughts, pieces of inspiration you see on Instagram or Pinterest, themes, things you just want this thing to be about, all the way down to specific decisions on typefaces and colors. All of these things are represented in this array of shapes and objects, and they all sort of sit in this wide open expanse of what's possible. I like to dumb things down when I think about anything, especially anything that's complex. And when I think about brand, ultimately, I just dumb it down to you have an audience, you have people, your target people, and then you have an objective. And the objective for a hotel is to get people to stay, to get people to book and transact, to get people to the website, to get people to click on the link in the website and then go through with that objective. And in order to get somebody there, complete stranger, if you built the first novel property, you couldn't just walk up to a stranger on the street and say, hey, I have a hotel upstate, you want to stay? That's an extreme example, but there's obviously things that you need to communicate to them. There's practical things like, where is it? What is it? What do I do while I'm there? And then there's also the more emotional things that you need to or can communicate to them, like what you believe in, what the core premise of this concept is, establishing a connection and establishing trust. All those things happen, and they happen over time. It can be really short. Usually with hotels, if someone needs to go somewhere, then it can be much shorter. With something more experiential and destination-based, maybe a little bit more prolonged, and you have to have these touch points to really build that trust. They have to become aware of you first. They have to know you and what you are. They have to come to be interested, and they have to come to be interested enough and trust enough to put their money down and go stay. And there's old adages around this. There's this idea that, people need to see or come in contact with the brand or with marketing 7 times before they make a decision, or a certain amount of hours of interaction. That's kind of how I think about things. And if you really drill down and look at it, at each touch point, each communication point, it's not just one thing you're communicating. You may have let's say a social media ad or post that says something in particular, such as novels about giving creatives the chance to explore and create. That's a statement that you're saying what you're about, but also the imagery, the design decisions you choose, all of that is also communicating things. It's communicating things about what this brand is, how it feels, presumably how the property actually feels to experience. All these things are being communicated. And at each point, each touch point, it's not just straightforward. These different things, the ways in which you're communicating, the mediums in which you're communicating, the ideas, the themes, it's layered, right? And this kind of brings us back to that sea of clustered ideas and themes, formats, concepts, etc. What I'd like to do, and really this is where AI starts to come in, the biggest power I see with AI is the ability to actually capture, engage with, or grapple with immense amounts of information and ideas and themes and topics and data. And specifically with brands, what I like to start with doing, which is what you've been doing, is gathering all of those ideas, those inspirations, those emotions, the really logistical, practical things like what is this, how many units are there going to be, etc., to more of the vague, the emotional, like what is this about, what's the inspiration behind it, how do we want people to feel. All of the individual answers to those things, the individual pieces of information and communication, I like to get down and then start to organize based off groupings of like kind. And then those things get organized up ultimately into what you could call themes. And the reason I like to do this is twofold. Number one, every theme and also every individual point of information has its visual representation. So an example would be, okay, if you have an investment bank and an interior design firm, an investment bank's website is going to look much different than an interior design firm's website. interior design firm is about creativity. It's about bringing spaces to life. Their website's going to be maybe more like floaty and like images all over the place and lots of colors and more of a creative experience, where an investment bank is going to be black text, maybe some serif. It's going to be all nice and organized, communicating professionalism, technical expertise. And what I think with brands is, if every idea, every piece of inspiration for the brand, every singular piece of information that you need to communicate has the potential or has multiple visual counterparts, I think brands, and the best brands, ultimately are the unique combination of those certain visual component parts, those visual references to these ideas that exist within the brand's core, in essence. And you ultimately don't choose them all, but in finding those unique ones and combining them in your unique way, that's how you create a brand that's distinguished and different than anything else. And it starts by, first, you have to organize all these things. And ultimately, those individual things become the basis, the mood board, if you will, from which the actual brand starts to spring. When you combine that with the knowledge, the actual information and content of the brand, the things that you need to communicate, and you start to put those things through the steps of testing and bringing them to life, that's where the brand ultimately comes from. And this is a bit of a departure from the way the traditional branding process has gone, which has really not led with like visual. The brand has in the past led with thought and theory. A typical branding process has been similar questionnaire, and then leaving it up to the human to define step by step by step and really lock in certain things like brand values, brand messages. And then from that, the human making the jump to, okay, what are the colors, the type, the layout system, the graphic system, the icons, et cetera, that we can use to communicate this brand based off its values. What we're trying to do is almost flip that on its head, where, okay, if we can get all this information down, sort of organize it and group it, and then translate that into the options for the potential visual representations of those things. Now with AI, we can not only make that translation, which hasn't been possible in the past, but that's this idea of creative variables that we've come up with, where if you look at an individual visual, a photo or a website, the words that you would use to describe it, like creative or technical or more disorganized, those are all the words then that can drive AI to create mock-ups and representations for your brand. And then the other part being how that actually gets created by plugging in these words that describe the visuals that are based off our brand's ideas, and plugging that into these generative AI platforms. We can actually test everything first, test a multitude and infinitude of different directions, and change the role of the human from making decisions, making guesses and assumptions, and then going to create, to really just looking, seeing, and deciding what feels best, looking at as many options as they want to, and sort of resolving it down and filtering it down to what the final brand ends up being. And then almost tying that back up to those things of brand values and strategy, et cetera. So it's really about letting the visuals guide. And then obviously, once the brand actually gets done, you move from testing to actual production, which is like your final end states.